Shalom, and welcome to V'ahavta Yisrael, a Hebrew phrase which means you shall love Israel. We hope you'll stay with us for the next 30 minutes as our teacher, Dr. Baruch, shares his expository teaching from the Bible. Dr. Baruch is the senior lecturer at the Zera Avraham Institute based in Israel. Although all courses are taught in Hebrew at the Institute, Dr. Baruch is pleased to share this weekly address in English. To find out more about our work in Israel, please visit us on the web at LoveIsrael.org. That's one word, LoveIsrael.org. Now, here's Baruch with today's lesson.
We have seen that God is holy and that He has called us to be holy. And I think it's most significant that as we wrap up this 11th chapter of Leviticus, and I would invite you to take out your Bibles now and find that location, the book of Leviticus in chapter 11. And we're going to see two things as we wrap up tonight. Now, he's going to give us more instructions in regard to kashrut, these dietary laws. But the two things I'm speaking of is that he has called us to be holy, and he's done so within this chapter, at the end of this chapter, having taught us what is permissible and what is forbidden. And it's when we agree with God that we are holy. We, of course, must agree with the gospel. That's foundational, but we are declared righteous through that gospel. We have that eternal hope. All of that's true through the grace of God, through the sufficiency of the cross. But holiness is not just a declarative state, but also it should be a state that we enter into by action, by deeds, by behavior. And again, I always have to be careful because I say such a statement as that, and people will say, are you teaching a salvation by works? No, I am not. I have always strongly denied that. But what I will state and what I strongly believe is this, that when we are saved by God's grace, when we receive that free gift of eternal forgiveness, of eternal redemption by what Messiah did in our behalf, we didn't do it. We receive it as a gift through God's grace that we access by faith. So it's a free gift. But having received that, there are some implications. There are some results. We become born again. We become a new creation. We are regenerated. And therefore, we should behave now by means of that Spirit, by means of our new condition. We should begin to act in obedience. Are we saved by obedience? Of course not. But having been saved, we should desire to be obedient, and as we grow and mature in our faith, there should be an increase of obedient deeds. That's what discipleship should produce in our life. So we should be holy, not just declarative because of the gospel, but that holiness should also manifest itself in behavior. Secondly, we need to have discernment. And I would offer to you this principle. As we take seriously the laws of kashrut, the dietary laws, one of the outcomes that God is revealing to us here is through obedience to that comes a discernment, comes a godly perspective. We'll see that at the end of our time together. Let's begin. Leviticus chapter 11, we left off with verse 23, so obviously now we're going to begin in verse 24. And how does it begin? And these, and the next word is a word of defilement, of impurity, of entering into a state of being unclean. And what he's saying is this: these types of behaviors render us unclean. And what is that? Well, he says, everyone who touches their carcass. Now, we're talking about animals, and by the way, it doesn't matter what animal. If an animal is dead, we should not touch it. Now, obviously, There are some exceptions. We need to perhaps bury that animal, remove the animal from where it is, but there's consequences. Realize something. There is a significant difference, and it's very important that you hear this. There is a significant difference between being unclean and being sinful. We can do something that God says not to do, and it renders us unclean. It is disobedient, but it is not that there is a requirement for something to bring about a change in our status as far as an offering and such. We're going to see that sometimes it's simply time and a washing that brings us back to the state of purity, because we're talking about a spiritual or a ceremonial uncleansingness, not sin. Now, is it sin to disobey God? Yes, but in this case, we're talking about it in a different way. Look again. Everyone who touches their carcass, what will happen? By touching it, we're told not to. But sometimes we must do so. It's not an act of disobedience. It's simply an act of removing the dead carcass. And it says, one who does so will be unclean until evening. Verse 25. And everyone who carries, and this is this removal, that's how many scholars see this from the rabbinical perspective. Those who, and it says everyone who carries their carcass away, what is he supposed to do? Well, he is supposed to wash his garments, his clothes. And again, this one who perhaps buries or simply removes it from a location where we don't want a carcass to be, this one will be unclean until evening. So some will say, if you touch it, but sometimes we touch something, bishgaga, by accident, unintentionally. But in the second case, we with kavanah, which means intention, because of a purpose, we do it intentionally. Therefore, not only are we unclean until evening, but we also are called, as it says here, yichabes bigadav. He will wash his garment and be unclean until evening. Verse 26. Now, many times when you look at the English, they add words. Now, sometimes adding words are necessary for simply conveying the literalness of the biblical language. Other times, it's for the purpose of interpretation. And many times in this passage, and I'm talking about Leviticus chapter 11, they add words that are not there, they mistranslate words, and they do so in regard to a false interpretation. They haven't understood it correctly. What does verse 26 say? Every animal. So every animal which has that split hoof, but it's split, but not entirely. It is not fully a cloven hoof. And this animal, everyone that does not chew the cud that it brings up, it says in this case, they are unclean for you. So we ought not eat them. And then it says, everyone that touches them is unclean. So now we see what most scholars would see as a safeguard. If it's not for food, don't even touch it. And if you do, what does it say? Everyone who does so, they are rendered unclean. But here, some commentators put in the assumption that it's a carcass, that it's a dead animal. Well, if that's the case, is it permissible to touch a living one? That is a debate within the rabbinical world. For, let me give you an example, a dog. A dog is not kosher. We ought not eat a dog. But can we touch a dog? Well, based upon some commentators and some translations into English, they assume that we're talking about a dead animal. But it doesn't say that in the literalness of the Hebrew text. Verse 27. And all that goes upon its, and here we would have its soles. whether it's the sole of the hands or the sole of the feet. Now here again, if we're talking about an animal, we're talking about perhaps paws or its feet. Doesn't have feet like a human, but paws, in other words. Among all the animal that goes upon four, so a four-legged animal. It says, these in a general way, these are unclean for you. And now it says, and everyone who touches their carcass, they will be unclean until evening. So here, these animals, and what's the assumption? Well, all four-legged animals that have not been stated earlier by name or by definition, if they have that split hooves that are fully split, meaning cloven hooves, and they bring up their cud, then they are permissible, even though they may walk on all four, like, for example, a sheep or a goat or cattle. But if they do not meet this criteria, all the others, in a general sense, we can learn, they are unclean unto us, and we should not touch their carcass. Verse 28. And the one that carries their carcass, again, we learned the same thing. He shall wash his garments, and the implication is wash using water, and this one is unclean until evening. For these type of animals and these type of things, carcasses, they are unclean for you. Look at verse 29. Now, if you look at a traditional translation from Judaism, they also do not render what we're going to study in a literal way. They mistranslate it. Why? It says here, Ve'zeh lechem. Zeh is the word this. And see if your Bible puts it into the plural, like these things. It's not these things, but it's this. This for you. It is what? It is unclean. What is? Now we have a word. And this word has to do, in the King James, it uses the term teeming. And we can think of this as swarming. Now, some may say crawl, but it's not the normal word for crawl, but rather it's those types of animals, usually insects, that swarm together. But there are also things in the sea that do something similar, and therefore we'll come to that. But look at verse 29. This is for you, and it says, unclean. That which swarms, the things that swarm, literally individually, that which swarms upon the earth. And what is that? Well, now we're going to enter into a passage that gives many things names, but most of these we do not know what they are. Some we do, and I'll try to translate those that we do, but many of those we do not. Look again at that text, middle of verse 29. We have, for example, most would say that the first one, ha-choled, is the mole. And then we have the akbar, which is a mouse. And tzav, hatzav, is a turtle, according to its kind. So what it's saying here is that these things that are mentioned, those things and those that are of its kind, similar within that same species, these are unclean for you. Look at verse 30. In verse 30, we're dealing with a group of animals, creatures, that are closely related to lizards, different types of lizards. We have the anaka and the koach, and today the general word for lizard, lata'ah, and the chomet, and also the tin shemet. We don't know today what we're referring to. Your Bible may translate them with words, but we're not sure the identity. But what we are sure, look at verse 31. These things are unclean for you in every thing that teems or swarms. And everyone, all these things that are swarming, they are unclean for you. Everyone who touches them, and it says touches them when they're dead, this one is unclean until the evening. So all of these are unclean. We ought not have anything to do with them. Verse 32. And all which falls upon it from them. So all these things, and we can imagine very easily that these things do. They jump, they crawl, they can fall. So all which will fall upon it from them when they are dead. So maybe they die when they're on the wall and they fall into something. Whatever they fall upon, it is unclean. And from every vessel, whether it's of wood, or whether it's a garment, or whether it's skin, in this case we would probably translate that leather, or whether it's of sackcloth, some other type of garment. And every vessel which one does work with it, it is unclean. And it says, what should you do? With water it shall be brought. So now you can bring water upon it, and it's unclean until the evening, and then at that time we have ve taher, then it becomes pure. Verse 33. And every vessel of cheresh is like an earthen vessel. It says, which from these things one will fall into the midst. So we have an earthen vessel, and inside, in the midst of it, one of these falls. It says, all which is inside of it, it is rendered unclean. And it says, this earthen vessel, it shall be broken. Verse 34. For all food which shall be eaten, which shall come upon it water. So the implication is water brings a change upon the food. Now here again, this is not water that's used for boiling. This is water that comes upon it from a different source, not with intent, but without intent. That water, because water brings a variety of different things upon it. And it says the water coming upon it renders it unclean. And this is true for every drink which one will drink, and in every vessel. So if water comes upon a vessel, it also renders it unclean. Verse 35. For all which shall fall, or everything we might say that fall from their carcasses, the things that we have mentioned, upon it, meaning all from these carcasses that fall upon it, it will be unclean. Whether it's an oven, and here we have karaim, which is a stove top, maybe a source of heat, where fire, you put something like a reshet, some type of thing over it, like you have a grill and you put something on it of iron or metal in order that you can put the food upon it. So it says in this case, every oven or every what we might call today stovetop, if that happens, it shall be broken or smashed, and these things are unclean, and it should be unclean, they are for you. So if this should happen, then these things are rendered unclean. But notice verse 36. If we're talking about water, and the water is from a spring or a cistern or a mikveh mime, that is a special type of source of water that is acceptable, in that case, it shall be pure, meaning that type of water does not render something impure. But the one who touches their carcass will be unclean. So even if there's pure water involved, that pure water does not stop one who touches the carcass from being rendered unclean. Verse 37. For if should fall from their carcasses, so a portion of that carcass, upon a seed that is a seed which is going to be planted. So if something should fall upon a seed that's unclean from their carcass, notice what it says, tohorhu. It does not render it unclean, it is pure. Now why is that? Now here again, this is a supposition, but there is much writing concerning this. A seed, what does a seed have? We could use the Hebrew word klipa. There is something around that seed. And that covering, when it's put into a ground, it dissolves. And we see that seed comes alive and it begins to produce something. And it's that decay of that klipa, that covering, that we might say shelters it. And that's why, look carefully at our text, verse 7. If something should fall upon a seed that is going to be planted, the fact that falls upon it from some carcass, because there's a covering, it does not render it unclean, but it is pure. But notice verse 38. There's something that can change that. And 4, if water is placed upon the seed, and shall fall from the carcass upon it. So now we have that there's water. The seed is in water. Seeds are being soaked. And then something falls into that container that has a seed. The seed has a covering, a klipa, but because of the water saturates all of the seed, not just the covering, but that covering, that klipa, that's the Hebrew word, is porous. Water goes through, and therefore the unclean thing from the carcass contaminates the water, and therefore that water goes through the klipa, that covering of the seed, and therefore it says here that this seed is going to be rendered, look at the end of verse 38, Tameh hu lachem, it is going to be unclean for you. Look now to verse 39. For if will die from the animal, now it's singular. We might in English want to say if one should die from the animals, but it always is looking at things individually. So if one of the animal should die, which is for you for food, but one touches its carcass, he is rendered unclean for evening. So also what we're learning here is this: an animal that's clean, that it dies, also its carcass renders someone, just like an unclean animal, unclean for evening. Verse 40. The one who eats from its carcass, he shall wash his garments, and he shall be unclean until the evening. So now what you have is someone who takes an animal that has been dead. So the animal has died. It's not talking about one that has been slaughtered. It has a different status to it. So an animal that's dead, but because it's unclean, this person eats from it, and this one will be unclean until evening. And the one who carries its carcass will wash his garments, and the implication is in water, and this one who carries, removes, disposes, this is the thought, is unclean until evening. Verse 41. Now in verse 41, we're dealing with something that most English Bibles will say crawl, but it's the same word for swarming or teeming. So we're dealing with that type of thing that swarms or teams up. All which teems, the things that teem or swarm upon the land. What is it? It is unclean, and you shall not eat. Now again, we learned last week there's exceptions, but in a general thing, if it does not meet those exceptions that we talked about last week, those few types, it is generally unclean and it shall not be eaten. verse 42. And all which goes upon the belly, all which goes upon all four. So what goes upon its belly? Something like a snake, a crocodile, something like that. Now I realize that an alligator or crocodile has legs, but it says here, the one who goes upon all four, all, it says, unto all that have multiple, many legs. So this would be like a centipede or a millipede, something that has many legs. All that swarms upon the earth. Some will say crawl, but it's literally the word for swarming upon the earth. It says here, all these things that have many, many legs, many feet, we might say, that crawls upon its belly or crawls upon all four. It says, they shall not be eaten. You shall not eat them. For, look at the end of verse 42, for they are an abomination. Verse 43. Now here, and beginning in verse 43, we just have a few verses left. We're getting into some summary statements. And I would suggest to you that these summary statements is where the wisdom, the important things of this passage that we've studied, this 11th chapter, these important things are found. Verse 43. Do not make your souls an abomination. For everything that swarms, that teams up, that is swarms, it says here, do not make yourselves unclean by them, for you are made unclean by them. So all these things that team, that's the King James word, everything that swarms, it says, do not render yourself unclean by them. They make you unclean by them. You shall be unclean by them. For I am, and here's what we get into the interesting part. For I am the Lord your God, and you shall sanctify yourselves. What does that mean? That you obey these things, and it has a sanctifying influence of you. So if you don't obey them, you become unclean, and you're not sanctified. But if you obey these things, they have a sanctifying influence in you, and you shall be holy ones. What does that mean? Well, the word holy relates to the purposes of God. When you embrace these things, you're going to be better equipped to have that perspective, and God is going to bless you. Purity, unclean, no blessing. Purity, blessing. You are going to receive God's provision where you can carry out his purposes. For he says, holy am I, and do not contaminate, render unclean your soul. And all these things that swarm or creep, and now we have that word for creep or crawl upon the earth. Don't allow these things to be the things that render you unclean and unfit for service. Now, is it unfit for service indefinitely? No, we've already said most of these things are until evening. Verse 45. Now, verse 45 has something that relates to redemption. What is that? The exodus from Egypt. So notice what he says. For I am the Lord that brought you from the land of Egypt. What is God wanting to do? Give us instructions so we don't behave like Egypt. What's Egypt? In Hebrew prophecy, which oftentimes is Hebrew poetry. What is the number one characteristic of Hebrew poetry? Parallelism. What is Egypt parallel to? The world. So what he's saying here, verse 45, for I am the Lord that brought you up from the land of Egypt. And he says, to be for you, for God. When God redeems us, it's so that he can work in our life. And he's telling us here, and redemption is a big deal. The exodus from Egypt is a big deal. When did that happen? Passover. When did Messiah be crucified? On Passover. What does the blood of Messiah do? Redeems us. Not with a earthly or a physical redemption, but a kingdom redemption, that eternal redemption. That's why the blood of Messiah is superior, more beneficial than the blood of sheep and goats and such. So he says here, look at verse 45. For I am the Lord that brought you up from the land of Egypt to be for you, for God. And you shall be holy. What does that tell us? That God is for us to make us holy, holy one, sanctified ones. And that is to equip us to serve him and to fulfill his purposes. For holy am I. He wants us to be like him. And I think it's so significant. And I would just ask you to think about this. See, most believers, they read Leviticus 11 and they say, well, that doesn't have any relevance for us today. Are you sure? Are you confident that this is no longer of any interest to God? I would strongly disagree with those who say, yep, this is all of the past, no relevant for a New Testament believer. Well, let me ask you, what is the hermeneutical methodology that says, well, when we read from verses 1 through verse 43, no relevance. But in verse 43, yes, it's relevant because God is saying that he wants us to be holy. Isn't that relevant today? Doesn't God want us to be holy today? Look at verse 46. He says here, this is the law. It's the word Torah. It is the law. This is the law of the animal, the fowl, that is the bird, and every living thing that creeps or moves in water, and for every living thing that swarms upon the earth. So all of these things, every animal, every fowl, everything that moves in water, and everything that swarms upon the earth. So now we see it's a conclusive principle that we can apply to all creatures. And what is the purpose? Well, let's look at our last verse and we'll be done. A very important word, lehavdil. Lehavdil is a word that we see also in Genesis 1. And I would offer to you that this word is foundational for the believer, for the child of God, for the servant of God. That word lehavdil means to be able to make a distinction. We see that this distinction begins between light and darkness, between good and evil, what we could say right and wrong. And what God is saying here is this. We need to learn how to make a distinction. Let's read this verse. To make a distinction between that which is unclean and that which is pure, in a general sense, so that we will have discernment. There is a correlation between making a distinction and having discernment. Verse 47, to make a distinction between the unclean and the pure. And then he says, and he links this together, and between the animals that can be eaten and between the animals which you shall not eat. Now, all of this, when we look at it within the context of the last several verses of chapter 11, God speaks in some very general things, that he's our God and that he wants to be for us. He says, lechem, for you. He also wants us to be holy, meaning set apart for his purposes. He wants to give us discernment so that we can distinguish between purity and that which is impure, unclean, that which is defiled, that which God is not going to have any connection to. When I look at the last part of chapter 11, I see some very, very important matters. And I think it's highly significant that God puts these very significant things that he mentions in the last few verses of chapter 11, he puts them at the end of talking about those things which are permissible to be eaten and those things which are not permissible to be eaten. Let me conclude with this. People oftentimes talk about spiritual principles and say, here God's teaching us something that can have great implications on us. We look for the spiritual, not just the physical, not just the simple, but what we could call the spiritual component. And what I would strongly offer up to you is this, that there is a very significant spiritual aspect and outcome from these laws concerning what we eat and what we do not eat. Don't ignore this revelation. It was true for the children of Israel and that mixed multitude that came out of Egypt. And it also has great significance for the believer today, who have come out of this world and have a kingdom connection, a kingdom citizenship by the all-sufficient work of redemption that Messiah did on Passover when he died upon the cross. I think we should take with the utmost seriousness Leviticus chapter 11. Well, I'll close with that until next week. And we move on into the next chapter, chapter 12. It's a short one, but again, of great significance. Until then, may God bless you. Shalom from Israel.
Well, we hope you will benefit from today's message and share it with others. Please plan to join us each week at this time and on this channel for our broadcast of LoveIsrael.org. Again, to find out more about us, please visit our website, LoveIsrael.org. There you will find articles and numerous other lectures by Baruch. These teachings are in video form. You may download them or watch them in streaming video. Until next week, may the Lord bless you in our Messiah Yeshua, that is Jesus, as you walk with him. Shalom from Israel.